You don't know me? You don't know who I am. And probably by the end of this video, you still won't know. I could be a radical Islamist, or I could be a young French woman. I could be a Cambridge University student, or I could be an elderly Russian lady who's a Putin fan. I could even be a young lady who's a fervent supporter of Trump, or I could be a middle-aged Portuguese man sitting by the sea writing this text. You don't know. You have no way of knowing. And that's largely due to AI. You might even think I'm a man because of my voice. But you don't know if I'm a woman. What if I told you that this whole video is made using AI tools? There's no way to know. That's partly how AI can impact your life, your decisions, your tastes, and customs. The question of whether a piece of text was generated by a human or a machine used to be something academics argued about in narrow publications that almost nobody outside their specific departments ever bothered to read. But now it sits inside nearly every serious conversation about how people work and create and understand themselves in relation to the tools surrounding them. The shift happened faster than most observers recognized, and the ones least prepared to notice it were often the most directly affected, which is a pattern that has recurred throughout the history of automation, and is recurring again now with more speed and less warning than previous transitions produced. I want to go through the evidence carefully because the evidence is worth that attention. In 2023, Goldman Sachs estimated that generative AI could automate the equivalent of 300 million full-time jobs globally, and that figure circulated for approximately 2 weeks before disappearing into background noise, the way large, uncomfortable numbers tend to do when they're too large to sit with comfortably. Nobody organized around it in any sustained way, and the economy continued operating as though the number had never been said out loud by anyone. What actually happened was more gradual, and in some ways more difficult to trace than a single rupture would have been. Across industries, the floor for what counted as skilled work shifted slightly downward in ways that accumulated before they were noticed, with tasks that once required months of structured training now requiring a well-constructed prompt and some patience, and tasks that required genuine domain expertise now requiring expertise operating alongside a system that processes the domain faster than any individual can, regardless of whether it truly understands it. This sounds like progress, and in many documented cases it genuinely is. A single analyst in 2024 routinely produces output that would have required 3 analysts working in parallel in 2018, with response times, shortened and error rates measurably reduced across certain categories of work. I don't think the efficiency argument should be dismissed because it represents something real. But here's what most people didn't realize at the time the adoption curves were steepening. When a task becomes frictionless, the friction doesn't disappear, it relocates. The cognitive weight of producing work is also where most of the learning accumulates over time. And there is a well-documented concept in educational research called desirable difficulty. The principle that tasks are more durably understood when they require genuine effort rather than being made artificially smooth. And I think the same logic applies well outside formal classrooms. A junior writer who spends 3 years struggling through mediocre drafts develops something that a generative model cannot replicate. A working understanding of why certain choices fail, built through the direct experience of making those choices and watching them fail, in front of a real audience that responds with real indifference, and that kind of knowledge cannot be downloaded or prompted into existence, regardless of how the prompt is constructed. If that struggle is bypassed entirely for a technically cleaner deliverable, the output may genuinely be better while the practitioner remains underdeveloped in ways the organization won't detect until the gap has been compounding quietly for years. The efficiency is always visible in the reporting, the hollowing compounds in the background, in the people over time. How many organizations are actively measuring the rate at which human expertise is being deprioritized as a structural consequence of AI-assisted workflows? I haven't found a broadly adopted framework that does this with any rigor, and the absence of that measurement is not simply a methodological gap. It reflects which costs are considered worth tracking, and which are allowed to accumulate unexamined. The less examined category is leisure, partly because it feels unserious relative to employment, and partly because the changes in that domain are so thoroughly normalized that recognizing them now requires deliberately stepping back from what has come to seem entirely unremarkable over a relatively short period. Streaming platforms select content based on aggregated behavioral data gathered across enormous user populations, and then present that selection to the individual as a personalized choice, reflecting their own preferences back at them. And the practical effect is that a viewer sits down with a genuine belief that they chose something, when in fact a system made that selection and framed it in a way specifically designed to feel like autonomous volition. This is not a conspiracy. It is a published design philosophy that Netflix has released internal research papers discussing openly, and Spotify holds a substantial patent library related to mood-based audio delivery that is available for anyone to read. The architecture of modern leisure is openly computational, openly acknowledged by the companies that built it and almost entirely unremarked upon in daily life. Whether this is harmful depends entirely on what it displaces over time. Before algorithmic curation became the default, discovering film or music or literature required a combination of effort, luck, and social transmission that was inefficient in ways that mattered. A friend recommending something they couldn't quite explain, a radio station playing something unrecognizable between songs you already knew. The randomness embedded in those older systems was not a flaw waiting to be corrected, but rather the mechanism through which individual tastes expanded into territory that didn't fit any existing profile, through which people regularly encountered things they would never have reached by searching deliberately for something they already knew they wanted. A system optimized for engagement has no structural incentive to introduce genuine novelty, and the result accumulated across years of use is a narrowing that presents itself as abundance, because the feed is always full, even as what it contains increasingly resembles only what was already there before you arrived. I find this worth naming precisely because it operates entirely below the threshold of obvious harm, and the costs don't arrive in any single identifiable moment that would prompt a clear response. This is where things become more interesting and considerably more difficult to reason about. There is now a substantial industry built around AI-assisted personal decision-making, encompassing career planning tools, communication assistants that help people draft difficult emails or handle sensitive conversations, mental health chatbots that some people now use daily, and financial systems that can produce a detailed retirement plan in under a minute based on a handful of inputs. And in each case, the underlying premise is identical, which is that the machine accesses more data than any individual can hold, processes it without the emotional interference that distorts human judgment, and therefore produces a more reliable outcome than individual deliberation would generate alone. For narrow bounded problems, this holds reasonably well, and the results are genuinely useful. The complication arrives when the decisions being delegated are not narrow or bounded, when the question involves competing values rather than competing data points, and when what matters most is not the output but the process of arriving at it. Think about what Kasparov described when playing against increasingly powerful chess computers. The specific disorientation of competing against something that processed the board through an entirely different cognitive architecture, where ordinary methods of preparation didn't transfer cleanly because the opponent had no tendencies in the human sense. Only evaluation functions running at depths no human could fully track, and the asymmetry was destabilizing precisely because it couldn't be addressed through the means that had always worked before. I think that structural disorientation now describes something happening in everyday decision-making, not because AI outputs are wrong. Often they are technically reasonable and occasionally they are genuinely better, but because the act of deciding is itself meaningful in ways that survive the decision and outlast it. The process of weighing competing values, sitting with genuine uncertainty, making a choice and accepting its consequences, is not inefficiency waiting to be removed from the workflow, but rather where judgment forms, and where something like identity accumulates through repeated practice over time. If the deliberation is fully delegated, you keep the result but lose the formation. And that trait is not as neutral as it presents itself. The files don't close cleanly here, and I want to be careful not to overstate what the evidence supports. AI is not a villain in this story, and framing it that way would obscure the genuine costs by replacing them with a simpler narrative that requires less effort to hold. The tools are useful. The efficiency gains are real and distributed across populations that genuinely benefit from them. The reduction of routine drudgery matters to actual people experiencing less of it, and I hold that position without reservation. But the pattern across work, leisure, and personal judgment is consistent enough across domains to warrant direct and sustained attention rather than the background hum of concern it currently receives. Because in each domain, the introduction of AI produces visible short-term gains alongside invisible long-term costs that are difficult to attribute. difficult to measure in standard frameworks, and therefore structurally easy to deprioritize indefinitely until the gap becomes impossible to ignore. The atrophy of effortful practice, accidental discovery, autonomous judgment. These rarely appear in any report until they are already well advanced. The early internet was described as a system that would give individuals access to the accumulated sum of human knowledge, which was true and also incomplete, because what it became structurally was something closer to the inverse. A system that gave corporations access to the behavioral patterns of individuals at a scale no previous institution had achieved. AI extends that same logic further and faster and into more intimate domains than the early internet reached. It doesn't only reflect what people do, it begins to shape what people do, what they encounter, and which options feel available in the first place. Whether the narrator of this script is a person in a room or a process running on a server is, in some sense, the wrong question to anchor on. The more useful question is whether the pattern described is real. And if it is, what you intend to do about it. That part, for now, is still yours.